My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the Library and Museum at the American Philosophical Society, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you all to Science and Society in the Age of Revolutions. Now, before we begin today's program, I want to read the land acknowledgement that we use to open all public programs at the APS. The American Philosophical Society resides in Lenape-Hoking, the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape people. The APS acknowledges with respect their continued presence and perseverance, and expresses its sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of numerous indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration. I want to just very briefly give you a sense of where you are and why we believe this conference is both timely and relevant. I should ask, how many of you have been to the APS before? Okay, this is going to be very brief then, very brief. The APS was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin as North America's first learned society. It was also, in effect, the continent's first science society. It has been a collecting institution ever since. We remain active today and focus on early American history, Native American and indigenous cultures, and the history of science. This last, of course, is especially important for the next 2 days. Well over half of the material at the Society's Library and Museum documents the history of science. These collections include manuscripts and printed materials, images and photographs, as well as important collections of oral histories and audiovisual material. We like to say that in terms of subject area, we go from A to Z, so astronomy to zoology, with particular strengths in genetics, evolutionary biology, and the life sciences. We have 6 examples for you to peruse during the break or in the morning when you come back tomorrow, and I encourage you to take a look at them. These link in important ways to one of the projects that will be discussed in the keynote panel this evening. They include a plant listing from William Bartram, a commonplace book by Benjamin Rush, a list of weights and measures by Catherine Haynes Hartshorn. Oh wait, this was the audience participation moment. Sorry. So this particular project is supposed to be documenting 6 lesser-known revolutionary scientists. So this is where I need your participation again. By a show of hands, how many of you know of William Bartram? Okay. How many of you know of Benjamin Rush? Yeah. How many of you know of Catherine Haynes? Okay, I'm feeling a little bit better about that one. The other series of documents are David Rittenhouse's Transit of Venus. How many of you know of Rittenhouse? Okay. How many of you know James Madison and his meteorological journals? Tiniest handwriting ever. Joseph Priestley and his essay on the conversion of air to water. So Priestley? Right. I understand that you may be thinking, but Michelle, did you not just say that these are supposed to be 6 lesser-known revolutionary scientists? They are indeed, but please do acknowledge that this room is skewed. I would bet you, any of you, $100 that if you went out to the street and asked the next 10 people you met who William Bartram was, they wouldn't know. At least 8 out of 10 wouldn't know. Would anyone like to take my bet? I didn't think so. All right. So, Center for the History of Science. These collections are so central to what we do at the APS that last year we established the Center for the History of Science to steward these materials, to add to them, to promote their research, and to hold public programs like the one you will be participating in today and tomorrow. Now, this event is very much a collaboration in every sense of the word. While the APS is hosting you today, and for part of tomorrow, and then the Science History Institute will be hosting in the afternoon, this was a collaboration between the 3 institutions that you see on the screen. And there are particular people that we need to thank for their hard work in bringing this rich and invigorating program together. So please join me in thanking, from the American Philosophical Society, Adriana Link, Brenna Holland, and Thomas Johns. I wasn't done. From the Science History Institute, Judith Kaplan, Charlotte Abney Solomon, and Jesse Smith. And one more from the College of Physicians, Sarah Ray and Erin McCleary. And while I know you have an ambitious schedule, I would be remiss, since I am the director of the library and museum, if I did not encourage you to take advantage of your proximity to the APS Museum, which is currently hosting Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City, which uses documents and objects to illuminate the lived experiences of Philadelphians up to, during, and after the War for Independence. It is free and open to the public from Thursday through Sunday from 10 until 5, so maybe a tiny break option, or if you are local, it will be up until the end of the year. So you have no excuses. Bring your friends and bring your family, and come often. Now, I get to open panel 1, Science on the Front Lines. This will be chaired by Brenna Holland, who is the Assistant Director of Library and Museum Programs here at the APS. She earned her PhD from Temple University in Early American History. Before joining the Society, Brenna taught at the University of the Sciences, served as an editorial assistant on the Journal of the Early Republic, and held fellowships from the McNeil Center for Early American Studies and the American Philosophical Society. Brenna?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to welcome the whole panel to come on up. Take a seat. Doesn't matter which one. All right. Well, I'm really pleased that we'll be kicking this conference off with 3 excellent papers. I'm going to start by introducing all 3 panelists in the order in which they will be speaking, and then they'll come up here and share their papers, and then we'll open it up for what I hope to be a lively conversation. So first, we will hear from Vaughn Scribner. Vaughn is an associate professor of history at the University of Central Arkansas. He is the author of 3 books: Under Alien Skies, Environment, Suffering, and the Defeat of the British Military in Revolutionary America, out of UNC Press in 2024, Mer People, A Human History, out in 2020, and In Civility, Urban Taverns, 2 words, In Civility, Urban Taverns and Early American Civil Society, published in 2019, in addition to a number of other articles, book chapters, and other publications. He's currently writing a biography of America's original celebrity influencer, Lord Timothy Dexter of Newburyport, Massachusetts. Then we will hear from Adam Bridgen. Adam is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow in the Department of English Studies at Durham University. His research considers the social and political dimensions of long 18th century literature, focusing specifically on British laboring class poetry and its engagement with the subjects of transatlantic slavery, resource extraction, and humankind's relationship with non-human animals. He recently co-edited British Working Class and Radical Writing since 1700 with University of London Press, which is published open access today, correct? Congratulations to Adam on that publication. His paper today draws on that essay, an essay for this collection, and will also feature in his forthcoming monograph, Anti-Slavery Before Abolition. Our last but not least paper will be from Stephen Walton. Stephen is an associate professor of history at Michigan Tech University in the Department of Social Sciences and graduate program in industrial heritage and archaeology. His academic work studies the origins and evolution of American industrial capacity from the colonial period to the early 20th century, particularly military industrial production, no surprise for this panel. He has worked on diverse periods and specific topics within this broad field, on gunnery and instruments in the early modern era, on American torpedoes and the civilian scientists who helped the Navy create them, as well as on patent disputes over artillery at the end of the 18th century. And is currently even on a project on the development of numerical control machinery for helicopter rotator blades after World War II, so quite wide-ranging. So without further ado, I want to leave plenty of time for our conversation. I am going to ask Vaughn to come on up and start off our conversation.
All right, so can you guys hear me okay? Great, okay, so someone's, oh, yeah, there you go, didn't sound right. Okay, So I'm really happy to start off this conference. I'm really excited for the next couple of days. And I will say, I'm going to start it off on a rather dire note, a very emotional note today, with my paper, Devastation Nation, Environment Suffering, and, Emotional Suffering and Suicide Among Soldiers in the Revolutionary War. Now, I already tripped up because this is based off of my book, but it's Under Alien Skies, Environment Suffering and the Defeat of the British Military in Revolutionary America. But I'm doing a couple different things. In the book, I look at British and German soldiers who came over to fight in the American Revolution and investigate how their perceptions and their physical realities with the environment really created a lot of suffering among their ranks, including mental and emotional suffering. Now, today I'm going to be concentrating on just emotional suffering among troops in the American Revolution, but I'm going to be broadening out. And I'm not just looking at German and British soldiers, but I'm also looking at American and French soldiers as well. Now, I want to start off with a little anecdote. So I'm going to do a little reading here to start off. On April 22nd, 1783, the rebel-controlled Pennsylvania Packet published a suicide account. Relayed from a gentleman in Fredericktown, Maryland, this horrid act centered around Captain Rim of the hereditary Prince of Hessia's regiment, who, quote, cut his throat with a razor and penknife, of which he died an hour or two afterwards. The author explained that the surgeon attempted to stitch up Captain Rim's gaping throat, but the unhappy man forced the surgeon away, and pointing to the instruments of death, motioned as if he wished him to enlarge the wound. Further capitalizing upon readers' curiosity, the packet explained, it is said he attempted to kill himself some time past, but as prevented by his friend, we know not the cause of this desperate act. As is still so often the case, we strive to understand the cause of this desperate act, suicide. We'll never know why Captain Rim committed suicide, or if Captain Rim even existed. This horrid act, after all, was relayed by a rebel press in the waning days of the American Revolution, when American newspapers were littered with false reports intended to honor their glorious cause, at the same time they denigrated their enemies. But let us suppose that Captain Rim did exist, and that he did commit suicide. As this presentation demonstrates, Rim was hardly alone in his feelings of emotional suffering and of self-murder or suicide during the American Revolution. Only 6 years earlier, after all, Major General Israel Putnam privately informed George Washington that the American military chaplain, Abel Leonard, slit his own throat. Of course, Leonard's suicide never enjoyed the same kind of press as did Rim's, as it did not fit into Americans' carefully honed efforts at presenting the American Revolution and Continental soldiers as paragons of masculinity, virtue, and honor. Historians of the American Revolution have remained surprisingly silent on the issues of depression, anxiety, homesickness, and suicide among troops. Now, conversely, various award-winning books and articles tackle suicide, death, and suffering during the American Civil War, for example, and plenty of other wars, which not only highlights the potential of these kind of studies, but also Civil War's willingness to embrace the emotional messiness of war. I think it's time that historians of the American Revolution followed suit. So my paper in this presentation today tackle combatants' struggles with emotional illness and mental health and suicide to uncover the very emotionally charged experiences of Revolutionary War combatants. Theoretically, emotions were discouraged. Soldiers should work as a cohesive whole to defeat the enemy, full stop. But highbrow ideals hardly and rarely translated to reality. Whether or not contemporaries wanted to admit it, war was a shock to the senses, not to mention theories of masculine military order and power. Early on, or a few years into the war, John Adams wailed that the English malady is upon us. The disposition of suicide, which destroys so many individuals among us, has seized the public. He wasn't wrong. Suicide accounts and at least publication of suicide accounts were way up during the American Revolution. They had been for a while in England. George Chain had written his treatise, The English Malady, in the early 18th century, where he argues that the disposition to suicide was highest among English people on the island of England. He had all these kind of reasons for it. But as the American Revolution unfolded in America, a lot of locals and invaders felt like they'd either brought the suicide, the disposition with them, and or it exploded in America. Now, we can see this in soldiers' accounts, of which there are many. Now, this is a rather long one, but it's showing this pattern that the British officer Frederick Mackenzie is noticing among his troops. As he says, a soldier of the 43rd was drowned this evening. There's imagining he did it willfully, as a paper was found in his clothes on the shore indicating such a design. His having left a wife and child desolate in England. The next day, he wrote, a soldier of the 43rd Regiment shot himself last night in the rear of the camp. The discovery of a connection he had with a married woman of the same regiment appears to have been the cause of this rash action. I cannot help observing here that a soldier of the 22nd Regiment shot himself through the body, of which he languished about 12 days, and that another soldier of the 43rd cut himself with a razor across the wrists since we have been encamped. So Mackenzie's recording this, and he's noticing this pattern. Now, this was a pattern that was not unique to the British. It was not unique to Frederick Mackenzie's diary. Now, to understand what Frederick Mackenzie was noticing and to understand how these soldiers are feeling and acting, we also have to unpack the ways that they described emotional and mental health at the time. Then as now, emotional health is an evolving field of science. So, for instance, what we call homesickness, they would have called nostalgia. A Swiss physician started studying this in the late 17th, early 18th century. What we call depression or anxiety, they would have called melancholy. And then what we call suicide, they would have called self-murder. Legally at the time, oftentimes, if a soldier or someone killed themselves, they weren't given a Christian burial, and their family wasn't able to collect their belongings and their money because they were murderers by law and that they'd murder themselves. Now, in Under Alien Skies, I really explore the environmental facets to this because I'm looking at the British and German soldiers who come over to the New World environment. According to science at the time, coming to a new climate or environment could change your very physical, emotional, and mental being. As the Hessian surgeon Schultz argued, most newcomers to this country have to pay tribute to the climate by some indisposition or another. Another British colonist called the British and German soldiers invading seeds that weren't fit for this American soil. So there's this very deep idea that coming to America was going to really mess with their minds and bodies. But that doesn't account for the American and the French troops who also struggled with these mental health and suicide. So today I'm going to be broadening out. Now, Washington recognized this. From almost the moment he takes over the command of the military, he's bemoaning his troops, and he's bemoaning their mental state. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but he describes them as men just dragged from the tender scenes of domestic life, unaccustomed to the din of arms and totally unacquainted with every kind of military drill, are timid and ready to fly from their own shadows. This sudden change in their manner of living makes it so that they're more likely to run away and be homesick. And it infuses the like spirit into others. Now, while he's worried about how his own men might act and their emotional well-being, he's not so worried about his enemies' emotional well-being. In fact, he's hoping that his enemies commit suicide. In Boston in 1776, he notes in his letters that a couple or even more British prisoners have committed what would have been happy for mankind if more of them had done long ago, the act of suicide. So here we have Washington as well, thinking about mental and emotional health among his troops and actually wishing, bad mental and emotional health among his enemies. Now, you can see these instances of melancholy throughout soldiers' letters and diaries. The top one here is from a Hessian. This is a very emotional piece. I cannot understand the circumstances in which I now find myself. I'm obliged to go through all kinds of misfortunes, even the most disgusting. I'm in the saddest spirits. All my actions are at variance with my heart's feeling. I'm beside myself when I think of the consequences, namely, that I'm to be unhappy and unsuccessful. You really see these men, not as just these automatons, as it might be easy to think of them as, or if they wanted, their officers wanted them to be at the time. But as people, most of them have never fired a gun in anger, who weren't soldiers, and even the ones who were, like Philip von Kraft, who was, a Hessian mercenary, having a really hard time. You have Ambrose Searle, a British officer or soldier, saying, "We discoursed upon the dejection of our army, the elevation of the rebels, and the present posture of affairs. We were very melancholy upon the whole, and parted with wishing for better times." And then we have the American Rathbone. He is coming after a battle, and he has to help clean up. And he says it was his melancholy duty to assist in the burial of the dead, which brought him directly into the midst of these heart-rending scenes where the wife first recognized her husband, the mother her son, the sister her brother, and the body of a mangled soldier so disfigured with wounds and clotted with blood and dust as to be scarcely known. Now, while these are kind of, general accounts, I want to hone in on two specific instances of, in this case, French soldiers having a really hard time. So while plenty of soldiers succumbed to the mercurial rigors of war in the New World for a variety of reasons, the historical record contains two especially high-profile French soldiers whose eventual suicides poignantly demonstrate the fraught nature of gender, honor, masculinity, and power within warfare, and especially within the Revolutionary War. The two are Forrest and Custine. Now, Forrest's problem started on March 5th, 1781, when he refused to follow through with the Comte de Custine's orders to punish a soldier with 30 blows of the saber. Believing the man innocent, Forrest whispered in the ear of the punishing corporal to only graze the shoulders of the soldier. Custine was outraged at his subordinate Forrest's insolence, and after having Forrest refuse yet again to punish the soldier, threatened him with his cane. Believing himself dishonored, Custine stared down Forrest and called him, quote, a miserable creature whom I shall throw into the dungeon. This was a total affront to Forrest's masculine honor. And what would reveal itself as a career-ending move, Forrest challenged his superior, Custine, to a duel. But Custine had no respect for Forrest. He refused to see him when he visited his lodgings, and Custine's commanding officer threatened to hang Forrest. Rochambeau, finally, who's commander of the French forces in America, ordered that Forrest should be sent back to France in dishonor the next day. Finding himself shamed, lonely, and lost, Forrest locked himself in his room and, with a shrill pistol shot to the head, ended his life. But Custine's problems had only just begun, as Forrest's men demanded that Rochambeau punish Custine for dishonoring their leader. Insolent in the face of his inferiors, Rochambeau apparently replied, quote, "It is a fool who wants to kill himself." Forrest's comrades were furious. His cousin ended up retiring from the French army, while Forrest's soldiers demanded that their leader have a traditional funeral ceremony rather than the typical hushed burying of a suicide victim. An onlooker noted how the funeral proceedings were followed by an immense crowd. Everyone was there, from the commanding general down to the lowest valet. Nobody was missing except the Comte de Custine. Forrest's honor-bound suicide transformed into the downfall of Custine, with company-grade officers shunning him, complaints against his conduct occurring almost daily, and leading European newspapers attacking his honor. Although officials ultimately deemed him innocent in relation to the suicide, his inferiors now called him, quote, dirty bugger to his face. Now, like Forrest, Major William Galvin's suicide was directly linked to challenges of his power in a hyper-masculine, hyper-violent setting. Having served the French army with relative success in Virginia from 1780 to 81, Galvin's military chops seemed legitimate. His character, however, was something else entirely. The Frenchman constantly sent letters to leading Americans like Lawrence, Washington, and Jefferson requesting promotion, which he never received. This failure was probably largely due to Galvin's unpopularity with certain officers and his troops in general, so he's not as popular as his troops as Forrest. But it wasn't just Galvin's fellow Frenchmen who questioned his honor. At one point, the American rebel, Silas Deane, whispered to Lawrence about some, quote, very naughty tricks this young French adventurer, Galvin, had played in Paris. By July 1782, Galvin succeeded in his mission to demonstrate his military competence with a small but important victory at the Battle of Green Spring, Virginia. Now stationed in Philadelphia, Galvin hoped to build on these successes, but his personal fortunes seemed to diminish by the day. Not only were the major's repeated requests for promotion refused, at the same time his debts were growing, but his love for a local woman, Sarah Shippen, was also unrequited. On July 24, 1782, Galvin put a bullet through his own head. Yet, unlike Forrest, or any other suicide victim in this article, Galvin left a suicide note. In his dirge, he explained, quote, "Life has become a burden too heavy for me. I shake it off. Men who do not reflect will accuse me of weakness. They will be mistaken. That same courage which enables me to meet death would have also supported me in bearing any degree of pain." He also includes Sarah in the note, asking that a picture of himself be given to her, and the bearer, quote, "Tell her my gratitude for her friendship will be one of the last sentiments that dies in me." In a closing demonstration of Galvin's string of unfulfilled hopes, the major's final request that his debts be paid, a copy of his will sent to his mother, and his body, quote, "buried decently," were all ignored. No one stepped up to pay his debts, no will exists, and unlike Forrest's grand funeral procession, Galvin was buried in Potter's Field, a common square far from one of Philadelphia's many consecrated graveyards. Now, I want to end with allegory, because at the same time all of these men were having very real struggles with mental health, and some of them deciding to take their own lives, American officers like General George Washington start to take allegorical suicide as an honorable end. They're especially obsessed with Addison's Cato, a tragedy. It's later used in Trenchard's Cato's Letters. They love Cato so much, and this suicide and the allegory in it, that Washington actually has the play staged for his officers at Valley Forge. And it's no surprise that Patrick Henry, two of his most famous quotes, "Give me liberty or give me death, and I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country," are directly cribbed from lines in Cato. It is not now time to talk aught but chains of or conquest, liberty or death. And what a pity it is that we can die but once to serve our country. Now, once again, this was allegory. The fact of the matter is, most of the men who were struggling couldn't rely on allegory. They weren't elites. They were trying to figure out how to survive in a war that they didn't understand. And so I think investigating this more gives a harsher but also clearer picture of the war and the suffering that was, inherent in creating our nation. Thank you.
Right, wonderful. Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be on this illustrious panel and to be offering something of a marginal British perspective on the way in which the revolution has influenced science in some small ways that I'm trying to trace currently. And we'll be going into a sphere that seems quite unrelated to the American Revolution, but I hope that some parallels kind of emerge and lead to interesting discussion. So, from the beginning of the 18th century, a number of former slave ship surgeons across Europe published texts reflecting on their professional involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. These include Thomas Aubrey's 1729, The Sea Surgeon or Guinea Man's Vade Mecum, and John Atkins' 1742, The Navy Surgeon or Practical System of Surgery, with continental examples such as Necessary Instructions for the Slave Traders by the Swiss surgeon and university lecturer David Henry Galandat, printed in the Netherlands in 1769, or Louise Roop's Diseases of Seafarers by a former chief surgeon of the Dutch West India Company. All of these works reflect the close entwinement of transatlantic slavery and the medical profession across Europe. As Galandat proudly wrote, the success of the slave trade depends very much on the good procedures and skills of the surgeons. As the opportunities for employment on commercial or combat vessels expanded over the early modern period, tropical and maritime medicine had become a profitable area of inquiry. With the extreme conditions and challenges they posed, slaving voyages were particularly prized as a form of practical training for surgeons. With the exception of Atkins, slave ship surgeons rarely voiced any opposition to slavery, at least until the late 1780s. Although their accounts addressed the challenging conditions, the necessary violence of slaving voyages was routinely minimized. With little acknowledgement of the contradiction involved, slave ship surgeons presented their work as doubly beneficial, providing expert advice that stood to benefit slave ship captains and their surgeons, and the Africans in their quote-unquote care. As university-educated physicians in prominent positions, Galandat and Roop were not representative of slave ship surgeons as a whole, however. In the main, they had little in the way of formal training. There was, however, in Britain at least, a different group who gained experience in the slave trade and wrote about it. The Navy was the other main employer of aspiring medics, without the means or connections to gain university qualification, and establish a practice on land. The Navy wasn't as prestigious or as expensive as being an army doctor, for which reason it appealed to men from poorer families. Unlike in the Army, however, the Navy then had no routinized system of half pay in peacetime. The Navy list, as it was termed, extended only to the most senior doctors. Many Navy surgeons' route into slavery was therefore circumstantial. According to his biographer, Atkins joined a slaving voyage sometime between 1715 and 18, at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, owing to a period of disillusionment with the Navy. As wars ended, this tended to result in an increase in slaving voyages, and thus offshored, demobilized Navy surgeons would find a ready market for their seasoned skills, often when they were at their most desperate. In Britain, this different route into the slave trade shaped, I suggest, a correspondingly different response to it amongst Navy-trained medics. From the late 1760s onwards, as European conflict shifted to the Americas, Navy surgeons not only found frequent opportunities to witness slavery, but also, licensed by the revolutionary ideas of this period, were drawn to oppose it more openly. Presenting a prior stage to the imbrication of science within the transatlantic abolitionist debates of the 1790s, as recently discussed by Eric Herfenschall, Navy surgeons significantly anticipated, if not influenced, the immediate shape and approach of abolitionism within Britain. Notably, it was two Scottish doctors who each drew upon their overseas experiences to pen objections to slavery. In the first instance, the cruelty of plantation regimes was a focus, as in James Ramsay's essay on the treatment and conversion of African slaves in the British sugar colonies. Expository accounts of the Middle Passage, by contrast, were extremely rare in Britain, with little published since the inclusion of an anonymous 500-word description in Anthony Benezet's early abolitionist textbook, Short Account of That Part of Africa and the Manner in Which the Slave Trade is Carried On, which was published here in Philadelphia in 1762 and then London in 1768. And I'll mention here, recent work has shown that it's thought that this anonymous account was by John Newton of The Amazing Grace hymn, but he anonymized it because of his concern for his career in Liverpool to try and join the church. It was not until 1787 that the newly founded Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade targeted the slave trade specifically, spurring fact-finding missions through Parliament and encouraging former slave ship surgeons, sailors, and the formerly enslaved to speak out. One text which predated this watershed was Observations on the Scurvy by the 26-year-old Scottish naval surgeon Thomas Trotter. Trotter was humbly born through his rapid ascent through the Navy, becoming in 1794 physician to the Channel Naval Fleet, has done much to obscure this fact. As his biographers argue, Trotter's reticence about revealing his social origins was typical of men who achieved distinction in their chosen professions, but who lacked the wealth and aristocratic connections normally necessary for success in the late 18th century, end quote. Born in Melrose in the Scottish borders, his father a baker, Trotter initially turned to work at sea because he couldn't afford a university degree. Like other Scottish medics of lowly social and financial status, Trotter was likely persuaded by the hands-on experience, pay, and board and advancement opportunities that membership of the Naval Medical Branch promised. He signed up in 1778 at the height of the War of American Independence. His first deployment was as the surgeon's third mate on the Berwick, defending the Channel against the French, and the year following in the West Indies. It was here, during time in port in Barbados and Jamaica, that Trotter would have gained glimpses of a slave-based society. By early 1781, the Berwick had returned to form part of a North Sea blockade against the Dutch. In recognition of his service at the Battle of Dogger Bank, Trotter was promoted to surgeon of the William, pictured here, then tasked with escorting coasters between Liverpool and Plymouth. In 1783, however, the William struck a sandbank in the Mersey, that's the river just off Liverpool. Trotter and his crew were stranded there and shortly after demobilized without pay, being no longer needed given the approaching peace. He scouted for other berths on Liverpool's docks and signed on as surgeon for a slaving voyage in June. The ship was the Brooks, a newly built copper-bottomed slaver, a ship that would just 5 years later become an infamous icon of the anti-slavery movement. Supplementing his practical knowledge Trotter had gained in the Navy, Trotter's 1786 observations centered on his ill-fated 14-month experience on the Brooks. If Trotter's hand-on approach to epidemiological inquiry was novel, even more unusual was his sustained focus on the scurvy as it broke out amongst Africans under the conditions of shipboard captivity. He introduces the subject with some context and a startling dissent. And I should make clear here that hereon we'll be encountering period language and imagery of a discomforting nature. It will be proper to observe here that these poor wretches are chained 2 by 2 by the wrists and ankles. Here they are stowed spoonways, as it is called, and so close locked in one another's arms that it is not possible to tread amongst them. The temperature of these apartments when nearly full was about 100 of the Fahrenheit scale. The effluvia is so intolerable that in a few minutes you may have the condensed vapor from your face in great quantity. Today, such realities are notoriously well known. However, in Trotter's moment, such descriptions were pretty unprecedented, not least evocative first-person sensorial ones like this. Observations undoubtedly reflects the paradoxical role of surgeons in the slave trade and the inseparability of medical care and violence in such settings. Seeing signs of the scurvy as the ship loitered for some months off the Cape coast, waiting to complete its cargo, Trotter preemptively sought fresh fruit from the mainland. As the scurvy intensified during the Atlantic crossing, Trotter supplemented the basic diet of the enslaved, that was beans, rice, and corn, and in doing so observed, I quote, "The scorbutic slaves throw away the ripe guavas while they devoured the green ones," end quote. In view of this, he began what we today term a controlled therapeutic trial, with 9 of the worst affected, and thereby discovered that, I quote, "vinous fermentation impairs fruit's anti-scorbutic factor," end quote. On this basis, Trotter was then able to refute competing pathological theories and reinforce James Lynn's earlier but infrequently adopted recommendation of citrus fruit. Expanded in a second edition in 1792, observations demonstrated Trotter's skills and played no small part in his rapid advancement. The purpose and framing of observations was unabashedly medical. Nevertheless, Trotter deviates from the standard clinical indifference to slavery found in prior works on the slave trade. If a sympathetic strain is evident from Trotter's opening descriptor, poor wretches, his description of the fundamental inhumanity of slavery becomes ever more apparent as the text continues. In addition to the circumstances of their confinement and poor diet, Trotter proposed that a concurrent cause of the scurvy was psychological. Again, positioning the reader aboard the ship, he writes, "I can by no means suppose the Negro feels no parting pang when he bids farewell to his country, his liberty, his friends, and all that is to be valued in existence. In the night they are often heard making a hideous moan. This happens when waking from sleep after a dream that had presented to their imagination their home and friends." The nostalgia resonances here will be very familiar, given Vaughn's previous paper. The initial indirectness notwithstanding, Trotter's words run into excess and convey not only the sensations of being aboard ship, but gradually shift perspective to the greater torment for those enslaved. To conclude his effective evidence, these outpourings of grief reflected an exquisite sensibility in Trotter's words. This sensibility, of course, was a capacity frequently denied by defenders of slavery. Trotter stopped short of any condemnation of the institution of slavery, the interests it served, or the government that supported it. He opens the work by stating his patriotic commitments, writing that it was written in view of the naval and commercial interest of these realms. In this practical vein, he also notes that commercial interests would be served by reducing deaths from the scurvy, and he provides at the very end of the work some brief recommendations to lessening confinement, improving nutrition, and providing better medical care. Though the fact it comes so late in the volume is really intriguing, and I think it might become clear what his kind of priorities are as we proceed. Trotter would subsequently be more overt in his opposition to slavery, though again through the provision of expert testimony. In 1790, he took 3 weeks shore leave in London to give damning evidence about the Brookes before the House of Commons Select Committee on the Slave Trade. His later criticisms of empire in his 1807 A View of the Nervous Temperament were also far less conciliatory. Notably, this came after Trotter had left the Navy due to injury in 1801. Looking back to Trotter's earliest writing suggests that his revelations about the torments of slavery and observations was not a volte-face. He had, in fact, been opposed to slavery before he joined the Brookes. Only a couple of months prior to the grounding of the William and the Mersey, Trotter had composed verses written in the Ladies' Walk in Liverpool in January 1783. That's the title of the poem. The poem, written from the vantage point of a fashionable uptown promenade, caustically attacks Liverpool's enrichment from transatlantic slavery, proclaiming freedom as nature's right, robbed from the enslaved. Worth note, too, is Trotter's broader attack on the wealth extracted from slave labor and the social extremes underpinning this enrichment. We can sense Trotter's resentment of the differential between the tyrant owners and the mariners who ferried their wares. Reflecting on this unequal distribution of risk and labor, Trotter asks of the indolent planter, did he, for wealth, e'er tempt the waves or wind? Also notable is the poem's uncertainty about the idea of freedom-bearing British commerce, which blessed the nations where she stretched her sail, an ideology which had long justified Britain's rise as a trading power, such as in Alexander Pope's Pacific Windsor Forest from 1713. Trotter resolves this tension by displacing British glory to an unspecified golden age, adopting here a stance of patriotic conformity in order to drive home his rebuke. That said, there is no evidence that Trotter published this poem in 1783. Like many of his works, it appeared later. Its first appearance was in 1790, printed alongside two other poems dated to 1781 and 82. Reading this poem against his 1786 observations makes the latter's tentativeness more curious. Did Trotter really leave the Brookes in 1784 as a dedicated abolitionist, as his biographers state? Is the absence of open critique in observations simply attributable to the formality demanded within the medical genre, or something else possibly at play? Clearly, Trotter's involvement in the slave trade makes judging his writing a fraught undertaking. We might, like Michel Faubert, doubt his sincerity and see his more limited statements against slavery as a kind of performance, a form of self-exculpation to salvage the respectability of himself and physicians despite their role in the trade. My reading is a little different, however. As I've argued in my longer essay, Trotter's near simultaneous rejection of slavery and his employment on a slaving voyage in 1783 draws into view a much more richly textured and complex relationship between written resistance to slavery, socioeconomic status, and maritime work in late 18th century Britain. Trotter's Navy career arguably had a more complex influence on his opposition to slavery than has yet been acknowledged. If, on the one hand, it exposed him to the stark contrast between Britain's celebrated wealth and the conditions under which it was produced, it also conditioned how he could speak about it, given what we know of the Navy's pro-colonial, pro-commercial, and tacitly pro-slavery ideology before 1807. After his ill-fated voyage, Trotter returned to the northeast of England, dividing his time between a riding practice and studying for his medical degree in Edinburgh. Trotter was likely conscious of the professional risks of taking an overt stance against slavery. Before the abolitionist campaign of the 1790s began to shift views, naval authorities imagined the slave trade to be a nursery for seamen, a vital training ground in peacetime. For this reason, Krista Petley argues that the patriotic connection between colonial trade, naval strength, and the preservation of national sovereignty made abolitionism appear dangerous, end quote. The Admiralty appears to have been resistant to the nascent abolitionist cause. Indeed, in 1783, they refused Granville Sharp's plea to prosecute the crew of the Zong for the murder of 132 enslaved Africans thrown overboard when the ship was stranded at sea. Purportedly, I should say, stranded at sea. The Admiralty's conservative stance may help to explain why so few individuals in active naval service seem to have spoken out against slavery before Parliament began to examine the trade in 1787, and why, even then, they tended to contribute only as evidence gatherers or formal witnesses. One of the most influential abolitionists prior to Trotter was the aforementioned physician Ramsay. A ship carpenter's son turned surgeon, Ramsay had left the Navy in 1761 after providing emergency treatment to the enslaved aboard a foundering British slaver. He took holy orders and became a pastor in St. Kitts, also providing medical service for several plantations. Published in the year of Trotter's return, Ramsay's essay on the treatment and conversion of African slaves in the British sugar colonies was revelatory in the level of detail it offered. Neither did he hold back in his explicit rejection of the trade in his published slightly later the same year, Inquiry into the Effects of Putting a Stop to this African Slave Trade, which was less about the conditions aboard ships, but the economic dimensions of abolition. However, Ramsay's activism only began after his retirement from the Navy. What's more, he was encouraged by Sir Charles Middleton, then controller of the Navy and behind-the-scenes abolitionist. He'd gifted Ramsay 2 vicarages in 1781, and besides giving Ramsay space and time to write, these livings also insulated him from the wrath of the West India vested interest, to quote Richard Blake, who's a scholar of evangelical abolitionism. In this light, we can see that Trotter's reluctance to openly condemn the trade in observations might have been influenced by his insecure position as an aspiring 20-something doctor, particularly one with the aim of returning to Navy employment and research. But that does not mean that the medical perspective forwarded by Trotter was not significant or strategic for the emerging abolitionist cause. Some, of course, complained that the work was not scientific enough. According to his biographers, initial reviews were lukewarm, deprecating Trotter's youth and wishing he had treated the subject on the usual theoretical level, end quote. Others had more profound problems. As one concluded, Mr. Trotter is well acquainted with his subject and speaks from experience, but we are sorry to add that his language is very exceptionable, end quote. However, there were more positive reviews as well, with his faithful observation approved in the New Annual Register and extensive reviews in French and Latin language journals. Observations was translated into German in early 1787, despite the difficulties that Trotter's technico-nautical expressions presented. The translation of spoonways into herring-like, that's from the German Wiederheringe, does not reflect the precise space-saving orientation of bodies that Trotter's term specified. If Trotter's work was initially praised for its findings on the scurvy, its revelations about slavery were more unprecedented. Observations preceded by 2 years the flurry of parliamentary and abolitionist activity to gather evidence about the trade. Surgeons naturally spoke on both sides of the debate, but Trotter's Navy credentials made his answers particularly credible and often reproduced. As mentioned above, Trotter's ship was subsequently made infamous in the widely reproduced illustration plan of the Brooks. While the plan depicted the likely distribution of captives under the recently passed 1788 Sir William Dolben Act, which acted to enforce a maximum capacity of slave ships on the basis of tonnage. The text detailed the even more extensive packing of the ship prior to this act. It is difficult to determine whether Trotter's observations inspired the selection of the Brooks. The fact, however, that two separate abolitionist committees, which included naval men in their membership, first the Plymouth Committee and then the London Committee, both independently settled on the Brooks to illustrate, is very intriguing. In any case, Trotter's description of the spoonwise arrangement of captives in the Brooks became later reattached to the broadside version of the illustration. With so little published about the Middle Passage by contemporary authors before 1788, it seems more than possible that observations played a role in why the Brooks repeatedly rose to notice. If this was the case, it would further reinforce the argument for the emerging and influential relationship between abolitionism and the naval medical profession, in particular in this revolutionary period. And here's a slide from Durham of school children recreating the image of the Brooks in 2007 for the bicentenary of the Abolition Act. And here's the end. Thank you.
Thank you all. Glad to be here. Turning from the emotions to enslavement to manufacturing. I'm afraid my paper is perhaps not as weighty as others, but is that a joke to be made? Canon, weighty? I don't know. At any rate, I'm very glad to be here. It's wonderful to be able to talk to people about a period that none of my colleagues study back at Michigan Tech, and I want to talk about canon founding. This whole thing is part of a much longer study from the Revolution to 1885, and the research question, as my social scientist colleagues would say, is why is it that the U.S. never had a national foundry until 1885? Every other advanced military state in the Western world, anyway, and in the East had state foundries. We didn't. So. The British colonies in what would become the United States entered the war as 13 provinces, but emerged a nation. Industrially, they were isolated, dependent on the home country, strictly speaking, forbidden from even trading with each other, and frankly, woefully underprepared to take on the mother country. And yet they did, and they won. This is a study how they managed to ramp up one element of military industrial production, namely cannon manufacturing, in order to meet the needs of the moment, and an exploration of the political economy in states' legislatures on how best to get it done. The colonists were somewhat up to arming themselves individually, but for large artillery and other capital-intensive technologies like heavily armed ships, states had to find, seize, purchase, or make their artillery they needed to take on the British forces. Recognizing these shortcomings, the Continental Congress explicitly and already in January 1776 allocated £40,000 to Silas Deane and ordered him to make a voyage to France to purchase for the public goods. Simultaneously, the Secret Committee contracted him to purchase 100 brass cannon and arms, ammunition, and clothing for 25,000 men. When he got there in June, he ended up purchasing 220 cannon on his own volition and arms for 30,000 men from all over France. He then furtively got them to the ports for export with a blind eye from the French, by permission of the Count of Vergennes. It was actually the British ministers he didn't want to be aware that this was happening, but he failed completely in that, they knew. Deane's consignments arrived here in April 1777, just in time to arm the Green's men with muskets for their victory over Burgoyne at Saratoga that fall. Larger guns, though, were needed particularly for ships and for defending ports, and as it turned out, the siege warfare that the colonists, had they been thinking about it, needed to engage in to win the war. Simultaneously, Washington, on the advice of Henry Knox, in July 77, advocated constructing a, can we call it a federal foundry? I'll try that. Federal cannon foundry at Springfield, Massachusetts. Note that the federal armory there did not exist until 1794, and Harper's Ferry not till 1798. Washington, quote, knowing the importance of and how essential these establishments are, end quote, his words, ordered that the works be begun there and trusted that, quote, as nothing but the good of the service could have led to this measure, I trust it will be approved, end quote. Congress tabled the motion on the matter and nothing happened at Springfield for the duration. However, despite Dean's mission and the constant seizure of cannon wherever they could be found, each province recognized it needed its own cannon too, their own cannon too. A cannon or two was held by many towns, some left over from the days of the French and Indian War, and more were purchased or taken or stockpiled as early as 1774. And so it's worth remembering that Colonel Leslie's famed retreat at Salem's North Bridge in February 1775, where the revolution might have begun, was about retrieving cannon from the Patriots. And Henry Knox's noble train of artillery seized at Ticonderoga in November of 75, even more so, but in the other direction. The story of revolutionary cannon foundries, therefore, seems largely to have been obscured by the Revolution-era literature on one hand, the intense local history praise for individual contributions that have upgraded many furnaces that perhaps made cannonballs to ones that made cannon, which is quite unlikely. The American firearm story, on the other hand, has also obscured cannon production, but it's worth noting that cannon are technologically a very different story in terms of skill, capacity, and market. So I'm trying to rectify these various local histories and place them in a better, larger context, and also break through the dominance of the top-down Continental Congress story, and for that, I point you to Robert Smith's excellent Manufacturing Independence. And I want to do this to recognize that the simultaneous motions at the state and federal level, to use our terms, in a moment where it was not clear that the latter would come to dominate what we would recognize as the national defense procurement policy. So today, I want to consider how various states responded to the military necessity of cannon from 1775 to about 1781. In a few states, the matter has been well studied. Individual foundries are well studied in Virginia and Pennsylvania, though differing greatly, as I'll get to, but rarely in comparative manner. In other colonies, the story is at least known, Connecticut, Rhode Island, while in some, quite a juicy story is virtually unknown, North Carolina and especially Massachusetts, where I got wonderfully lost in the Massachusetts State Archives this summer. For a few of the states, I have to admit I can't tell yet what's going on, whether there was any state-level activity or they just tried to buy what they could. In Georgia, they consolidated cannon, that's all I can find. In other of the states that don't have dots up there, it seems they tried to buy them on the open market. Fundamental to the question at hand is to what degree the individual states took ownership, direct or indirect, of the production process. So on to those strategies. When the war began, the obvious thing for states to do was simply purchase the cannon on the open market. But this is easier said than done. Britain had a quasi-monopoly on cannon production for the colonies, though many nations' cannons were scattered about the colonies. Lots of Danish cannon for some reason, I don't know why. That is cannon made in Denmark. Cannon could also have been easily on the market, had on the market from France or Belgium or Spain, but easily was certainly a matter of degree. Within the 13 colonies, there were commercial foundries near Providence, Salisbury, Connecticut, and in the number of them in the Reading Valley here in Pennsylvania that were already producing cannon for merchant ships and apparently for some state militias at the time. All rose to the challenge and supplied the various state militias to the extent they could, but each had difficulties in rates and capacity and were ultimately unable to meet the sudden continental demand, particularly for large cannon. In one case, in early 1777, New York State wrote to Salisbury, Connecticut, trying to order cannon, and the Connecticut governor, John Trimble Sr., responded, quote, "We shall do all in our power to keep the cannon foundry at Salisbury in blast through the winter, and shall spare no cost to do it, though we dare not greatly depend on the success of it." That's the governor of Connecticut. Noting that they'd already sent 10 6 and 12 pounders each, they had only 4 18 pounders and 2 9 pounders cast at the furnace, quote, "but had not at present water sufficient to bore them," end quote. And of course, New York was not the only polity in urgent need of them. Quote, "We have lately received a letter from Congress," Trumbull wrote, "wherein they express an ardent concern for a supply of cannon for the northward, earnestly requesting a supply from Salisbury Furnace. If the furnace can be kept in blast, and we are succeeded, hope shall be able to supply further." General Schuyler responded just under 2 weeks later that the New York had no hope of getting cannon from any founder in New York State, and the few that Trumbull promised, quote, "will, when we get them, still leave us amazingly deficient." Trumbull tried to assure him that the few cannon they had on Salisbury, quote, "are now boring out," and that the foundry will send them as soon as they can. Schuyler then pushed a bit harder. He had intelligence from Colonel Walter Stewart that Salisbury actually had 82 cannon finished sitting on the lot, as it were, and he passively aggressively shared that he knew that with Trumbull. Quote, "As that number greatly exceeds what you mentioned to me, I suppose you had not then a full return of the whole," end quote. 2 weeks later, Trumbull replied bluntly, "We're very sorry, we cannot supply you with any more cannon. We have already granted all the cannon that can be spared from our foundry at Salisbury." Now, despite the way that Trumbull talked about them as our furnaces, the furnaces at Salisbury were all owned and operated as private business interests under a couple of interlocking founders. And as far as I can tell, the Connecticut legislature, all they did was provide an urgent bridge loan to get the furnaces refitted and back in production in late '76, and then occasionally facilitated access to supplies or advanced money on credit as the currency began to contract. It's clear that in many cases, different states' committees of safety, or equivalent, were directly involved in providing material for foundries to do their work. And I'm a slide behind. In Pennsylvania, for example, the Committee of Safety directly supplied specific materials to Benjamin Loxley's brass cannon foundry in Philadelphia, south of here a bit, supplied some small capital, not enough to make it, to build it out, and then construction and production materials as the war went on. But they never seem to have expected to take any ownership, though they did refer to it as, quote, the public foundry. The state endeavors do seem to have gone well, but also revealed such undertakings to be quite expensive, and that the state was at least funding, if not running, most of the operation. The Philadelphia case, by June 1777, the foundry then being run by James Byers, lately arrived from New York, presumably having had to flee there when the British took that late in '76, the state Board of War was straining under the costs of the war, saying, quote, the treasury was exhausted and the demand for it very large, i.e. they were bankrupt, and they suggested that the state battalion of artillery be put under continental control, and additionally, that the expense of the gun factory and the cannon foundry established in the state, note, not by the state, but in the state, have been and still continues to be very great, and as the continent is now reaping the advantage of these institutions, the Board of War proposes that both of them be delivered into the hands of Congress. But the British took the city after Brandywine, and Loxley himself had to remove out to Oaks, PA. By the way, if anybody has archaeologist friends in the state, his foundry may in fact be under the parking lot of the Greater Philadelphia Convention Bureau. That's where it was anyway. So, the other notable commercial cannon foundries like the Hughes Brothers, Antietam, and Mount Etna furnaces near Sharpsburg, Maryland, or the Hope furnace run by the Brown family of Brown University near Providence, remained private throughout the war and cast guns as fast as they could, though could never meet demand, sometimes even of their own state. The other option for this political economy was state industry proper. This partially existed in Great Britain, where the Royal Foundry at Woolwich Arsenal, through their global empire, fed their global empire, but they did rely most heavily on private firms, notably the Cairn Company, established 1759 in Falkirk, Scotland. And this model predominated in most states and principalities across Europe. So let me start with the two clear examples in the colonies of this. Let me start with Massachusetts. As I say, this is where I've gone most down the hole. A century-old history, our century-old history, 1907, had one Marie-Louis Armand Ansart Marquis de Marsquel, pardon my pronunciation, coming literally straight off the boat on December 5th, 1776, marching over to the Board of War in Boston and telling them that he was there to help them set up a cannon foundry with the newest boring technology from Europe. De Marsquel was a veteran of the 7 Years' War in Europe and seems to have come to his engineering knowledge by volunteering to do it, and as any good Enlightenment gentleman, through an étude longue et suivie. Also, once here, he claimed to have been related, perhaps by marriage, to the great French engineer Marquis de Montalembert, but that is yet to be proven. Not surprisingly, that family got it a bit, shall we say, compressed. In fact, on November 21st, the House passed a resolve to employ de Marsquel in the business of the cannon foundry. But that business of erecting a furnace had been in motion for many months already, and that was the second, or what I will refer to as the Bridgewater, furnace plan. For that one, a cannon committee had been formed August 29th and asked to report, quote, without delay on what is proper to be done in respect to the manufacturing of cannon, which they did on September 14th, and the Bridgewater furnace plan was in motion by the end of October. The haste with which the committee formed, met, produced, and was activated was because over a year before that, Richard Devens, the Massachusetts Commissary General, had already worked out an agreement with Aaron Hobart of South Abington to cast cannon for the state. Hobart had established a brass and bell foundry in South Abingdon in 1769, utilizing the knowledge of one Gallimore, otherwise unknown, who had trained as a British bell founder, was sent to the colonies as a soldier, but then deserted his post in Boston and joined Hobart. In 1775, Hobart had proposed making guns and cast iron shot for the Patriot cause. And although the state furnished him with pig iron and coal, the results were horrible. Quote, Colonel Hobart had no knowledge of the business. In proving the cannon, they split. Iron could not be kept sufficiently hot. It chilled too quick, end quote. Although apparently instructed by Colonel Henry Burbeck of the Massachusetts militia, who became very important in American artillery after the war, Hobart may have had insufficient blast or the wrong furnace proportions. He may have had poor molds. Also possible the chemical composition of the coal or the iron or the mixture thereof was a problem. Quote, so disastrous was the experiment that all the stock provided by the state was expended, and his own fortunes besides were severely felt by Hobart and the public. Now, there's also a curious conflated mythology about a Frenchman saving Hobart's furnace, but there are no records that Hobart ever produced a single cannon for the Patriots. Now, as time compels me to be brief, the Bridgewater State Furnace Manufacturing Complex, approved in October 76 and in blast by April 77, the new style boring machine took a little bit longer to put in operation, produced admirably under direct state control and finance from 77 through 80 or even 81. It had, as you can see here, one iron furnace stacked to turn iron ore into pig iron and cast directly into cannon, as well as 3 air furnaces that allowed them to cast in both brass and iron. Hugh Orr, who managed the state furnace, suffered continual and severe shortages of pig iron, trying local sources, Rhode Island sources, even going so far as to buy in Baltimore in 77, and trying to slip past the British into Providence, with some success, although, as you can see, as late as 1782, 170 tons of it remained in Baltimore. Damarisquel seems to have been perennially absent, but his boring machine did work quite well, and within 6 months, they had to lengthen it to handle larger guns. So by all accounts, the Bridgewater furnace was a success. And yet, by early 1782, the Massachusetts Assembly was working on selling it. Neither Hugh Orr, who had forges going quite nicely in East Bridgewater, just north of there, nor the Keith family, local iron founders whose land they had given over to the state for the project for the duration, wanted it. It's possible that Paul Revere, or his son really, Joseph, bought the boring machinery as they started casting cannon in Canton, 20 miles northwest, but that was after 1788. So Massachusetts very clearly fully embraced the state industrial model, at least after Hobart's failure. And they embraced it, the idea of state industries for 3 state gunpowder mills in Sutton, Andover, and Canton. That one was run by Paul Revere, and at least 1 saltpeter works and a few other war industries. Moving southerly for one other case of a very clear state industry, in Richmond, the story of the Virginia Manufactory of Arms, VMA, and its musket and the bayonet manufacture is very well studied. The adjacent cannon foundry, the south end of the complex there, and boring mill has been largely forgotten. John Ballantyne and John Reverly were retained by the state to design and build and the Convention of 1776 allocated £5,000 for the undertaking, and it appears to have been completed by May 1778. It was to consist of 4 double stacks, 8 air furnaces, and a boring mill, all taking power from the lateral channels off the canal that runs parallel to the James River in downtown Richmond. Reverly, who seems to have been the technical expert, although I should put expert in quotes here, admitted, quote, the business of the air furnace was little known in this state, end quote, but still got it up and running, or ish. The problem was that due to the war, quote, and these are his words, the rapid and unforeseen rise of the price of labor and every article of life, end quote, destroyed any economy that even the £5,000 grant could cover. It appears that Ballantyne and Reverly built the furnace complex using their own advances that were to be paid back from the pig iron it produced. They proposed and were allowed to add a forge and slitting mill to increase a variety of outputs and hence profits, but economics made the whole arrangement untenable. As early as May 1778, just about the time it was being finished, the House of Delegates resolved to sign the foundry over to Ballantyne. But by November, quote, for want of proper workmen, that useful work is of no advantage to the state. Reverly tried, but apparently failed, to find even 3 knowledgeable men to run the place. He was given $400 and still couldn't find anybody. That 1776 convention also proposed building out Rockingham Furnace, some 15 miles west of Richmond, to supply the pig iron to the VMA cannon foundry. By November 77, Ballantine and Reverly sent a petition to the Virginia House that although the furnace was not complete, they begged that it had, quote, not been owing to any extravagance of mismanagement, but entirely to the high price of laborers, provisions, and materials necessary for the said works. They prayed that this, quote, scheme so promising and so nearly accomplished will not be laid aside, end quote. And since the, quote, land and slaves are already conveyed for the use of the Commonwealth, and the chief dependence for pig iron to supply the foundry for casting the cannon is on these works, that is the Rockingham furnace, that the House would appropriate more money to finish the job. In the end, by May 78, the House, as I say, tried to sign it over to Ballantine and Reverly, but there was even various dissension there on privatizing it or not. So it would seem it was in order. But by the middle of 1779, the House decided to convey the entire canal, foundry, and works on the James River to Pennet and Company, the French mercantile firm that shows up supplying Continental Army all over the place. The governor, Jefferson by this point, was required by House words to buy the land, develop a road to it, and perhaps a canal, so that Pennet and Company could develop 3,000 acres of land, as convenient as may be to the place where they shall erect their foundry, my emphasis, and also some place on or near the James River for a furnace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to build out a cannon foundry. Pennet and Company then would become the sole supplier for the Commonwealth, quote, for an annual supply of cannon and small arms after their completion of the work in such numbers, on such terms, and for so long a time as they shall think proper. At any rate, there's another whole other story. I think that there's the smaller dot is Westham. That's probably where the Pennet foundry was, but it gets very confusing and it's not entirely fair. So all this seems to be a model built on a state industry that turned into one, not unlike the Cairn Company in Scotland, of a private firm operating as a de facto state industry. Finally, I know I'm getting close to time, quick mention of North Carolina. In June 1776, the North Carolina Provincial Congress authorized $2,500, amount but not tons, to construct the Tick Creek Ironworks near Deep River in Chatham County. They started construction on a casting house, 20-foot square, not very big, a dwelling house or outhouses, managers, a boring mill, an undershot wheel as near as possible to the casting house, locks, hinges, nails, etc., etc., including 12 slaves, including a woman and a boy, necessary for carrying on the foundry, end quote. The Committee of Safety had already provided for a founder of cannon and cast ironware in all its branches and a founder of cannon, ball, and open work. And the state contracted, or tried to, for Pennsylvania founders to come down and start up the foundry. The long and the short of it is that they had trouble getting the Pennsylvania founders to come down. They were too expensive. They couldn't afford them if they found them. Often they couldn't even find foundry patterns for sale, and even if they did, they were gouged for them. And it's not clear that they managed to produce a single gun or even a cast iron pot. The site was sold at sheriff's auction in early 1778, but this was at least a full-throated, both feet first attempt at state industry in the colony of North Carolina. So, I've alluded to the notable lack of skill available in these states at the outset of the conflict to run cannon foundries. Key to understand, as most founders did at the time, was that casting cannon was a wholly different process than casting small iron or brass goods. In our terms, thermodynamically and metallurgically very different. Even brass and bell founders, who might have had a handle on things like metal shrinkage and cooling, which could destroy a gun, or having a large enough air furnace to melt enough metal to cast a large cannon, a 12-pounder, which was a medium-sized one, takes about 1.5 tons of metal to be cast. But even if they had the capacity, guns are cast upright, and they needed the depth, height, strong enough cranes to have an 8 to 12 or deep pit for the furnace. And in places like Bridgewater, they either were hitting bedrock or the water table, and as you imagine, pouring molten metal hitting water is a bad idea. Steam explosions. Oops. So, it's not entirely clear, one more, there we go. Not entirely clear who the workers necessarily were at most of these foundries, even to the point of figuring out who the person was who actually understood the casting and the metallurgy. The Hughes brothers in Maryland seem to get it quite well. In Massachusetts, the ironmaster very explicitly said he did not know how to cast cannon, while the so-called expert, Demarisquel, did, but that was a bit of an open question. The Board of War seemed to test him at one point to make sure he actually did, and I guess he passed. In other cases, ironmasters ramped up and did a good job. I'm going to jump past some of the other workers. There are some cases where prisoners are released to work for the furnaces, some presumably people who had skill. And in one case, James Stewart in Boston, guilty of acting in some instances as an unfriendly part to the liberties of America, was sprung from the Boston jail and sent to work at Bridgewater for Colonel Orr in a sort of work release program. So, to conclude, by 1800, the goal of the U.S. having a national foundry resonated quite widely. In that year, John Adams authorized a joint Army-Navy facility to house a school for engineers, miners, artillerists, cavalry and infantry, and the Navy, which proposed a national cannon manufactory at Harper's Ferry. The president authorized now $800,000 that might well have brought some or all of this to fruition. That never happened. Jefferson scuppered it like he did a lot of Adams stuff. Instead, Jefferson brought Henry Foxhall from Philadelphia to Georgetown to build the Columbia Foundry. That's the Georgetown University Observatory, so down by the canal. Nothing's left, really. That did act as a private quasi-national cannon foundry. The national foundry question continued for another half century, and it wasn't until 1885 that we finally actually built them. National Foundry. Thank you very much.
Hydration is important. All right. Well, thank you all for those papers. It was really, I think, productive to think about them together in this Science on the Front Lines panel. Over the next 2 days, we're going to hear a lot about a lot of different types of science and different people doing science. But I think that these 3 papers and topics together force together a series of questions about the roles that war and especially violence play in shaping scientific inquiry. So Vaughn, Adam, and Steve show us different ways that science operates on the front lines. And here, the laboratory that we're talking about, right, is war. And this wartime forced new questions, new modes of inquiry, new demands on society, new or renewed forms of violence that created conditions for both innovation, but also for exploitation in really, really significant ways. And so reading the papers together, one theme I kept coming back to was ideas about sort of collective or civic science around public health, around industrial science, and in the ways that collective knowledge and the science it produces, rather than the figure of the scientist or the frame of an experiment, for example, allows us to interrogate science as an object of study in a broader way. Another way to sort of think about it too is the function of the source material that you all are using in your projects. Exists because of the context in which it was created, exists because of these moments of extreme tension and violence, and those are the things that are being documented, but they sort of create, forgive me, like a microscope for us if we're historians, like looking back at the past, right? That's what these sources are allowing us to do. So war forged this sort of public science or public health, certainly not in a triumphalist way. And in these papers, we see those laboratories as foundries, as slave ships, and as army camps, as sites of potential scientific inquiry, places where 18th century people tried to solve problems, both scientific and social. And we also see then science as a tool to wield power over bodies and over minds. So for Vaughn, we see how the military, faced with soldiers taking their own lives, began to grapple with the conditions that may influence mental health and disease. So I was wondering what happens when we think about this as a sort of public health problem that these military leaders are really trying to grapple with. You rightly point out that historians have perhaps paid more attention to the bodily illnesses and diseases like smallpox, et cetera, for their analysis of health and medicine during the American Revolution. But is there innovation in public health to borrow from here too? I'm thinking in particular, Sarah Naramar's work on civic health, right? And the inspiration for Benjamin Rush going forward into the early republic. He's taking mental disorders much more seriously around this moment. What's sort of going on here? I'd also like to see you grapple a little bit more with the history of emotion in the late 18th century context, particularly where it intersects with gender. And I think that Nicole Eustace's Passion as the Gale and Sarah Knott's sensibility in the American Revolution will be particularly useful here. In Adam's case, we're seeing how naval scientists grapple with the moral implications of their craft in trying to keep enslaved people alive during the harrowing journey across the Atlantic. So here you seem to be showing how the authority of medicine and science in sort of a privileged place in society allowed Trotter to venture more openly into abolitionist stances. But I kept coming back to whether Trotter was an exception to the rule in reading and rereading your papers. So what makes his role in the Navy unique in creating this, or particularly important in forging his abolitionist stance? And I kept coming back to the passage, the particular passage about the scurvy that you quoted in your paper, and the findings he made about scurvy, for example, are only quote unquote his by the privilege of his circumstances as the doctor on board, because it seems like the enslaved people possess the knowledge about diet that he's observing and then constructing a sort of scientific experiment around. So this, to me, seemed more akin. I'm wondering if you shift a little bit to look at some 19th century cases, to work by people like Deirdre Cooper Owens on scientists working in plantation societies, and what role is science doing there, and how is that influencing maybe his abolitionist stance? But is he the only one coming to these conclusions? What percentage of these Navy doctors are getting there? And then I thought that this built in really interesting ways, actually, with Stephen's paper and his use of canon foundries as a case study for state-sponsored industry. This specialized scientific knowledge, as you show, is really hard to come by, and I can't help it, but one wonders if whether Hugh Orr got the job just for his name, or the State Furnace in Massachusetts. Fantastic name for a foundry leader. What struck me was how American military and political leaders seem to feel so very behind, both in industry and knowledge, but yet there is some serious investment in this moment. And so I think you're focusing on this sort of presumed failure of a national or a federal foundry, but there is a lot of presumed some success going on here. And that success and failure theme too is another thing that I sort of is one that I think we might grapple with over the next couple of days around like what we consider scientific success and what we consider scientific failure. But then I just wanted to ask, getting into sort of the mechanics of cannon making, I'd love to hear more about that. So what happens if a cannon is made incorrectly and it makes it into the field? Probably not so good. Presumably that's pretty dangerous. And so, presumably that's not a great outcome, and that is playing into maybe some of this interpretation of failure, but a lot of that it's getting there too. So I think I'm going to leave it there and allow each of you to respond either to me or to each other, and then we'll open it up for questions. We have a good chunk of time to hear from our great audience today. You're about to pick up the mic, Steve, but it doesn't matter. We can go in whatever order.
Well, just on the question of cannon, they're proofed at the foundry, and frequently, even the ones the foundries are succeeding, half the cannons will fail proof. They'll crack, they'll burst, or be problematic. The big problem is when you cast large things, there's large masses of metal, there's a lot of metal shrinkage, and voids form inside the walls of the cannon. Voids form inside the walls of the cannon that you can't see, and if that gets out of the field and it is fired, it will explode and kill your gunners. But most of those were caught before they were sent off to the militia or army. So yeah, it's a very difficult process, and that they didn't. I would say that science didn't get a handle on that metallurgy until the 1830s or 40s, at least as recorded.
Yes, I think that it'd be really productive as you develop this paper further to sort of get into what's failing in science versus what's failing in the political economy moment, and how those two things are influencing each other.
I'll answer you. Okay. I thought those were great suggestions. With the gender and emotions, I tackled that a little bit more in the book project with Eustace and Knott. But I think that's interesting and important too, because on our histories of the emotions in both early America and 18th century in general, for some reason it largely jumps the American Revolution, at least from a military aspect. And so I thought that, I'm not a military historian by training, I'm a colonialist. But I thought that these soldiers' experiences in such a traumatic time was a really interesting petri dish, if you will, to unpack these emotions. So, and going with Rush, J.L. Bell starts his book on suicide with Rush and the American Revolution. So we kind of skip the American Revolution often when there was this time when 80,000 British and German soldiers invaded America and thousands of French. And so I thought that was important, but I also think it's interesting to frame Rush as a reaction to the revolution, as him thinking about what he'd seen during the revolution and then transitioning into these new public health initiatives, of which there were many at the time. So yeah, I thought those were both excellent suggestions, so thank you very much.
Yeah, some really good questions there, and I think to grapple with first that kind of issue of the appropriation of knowledge or scientific or indigenous knowledges of nutrition, etc. That is really important, and it is something that Trotter's not acknowledging, and isn't really something that has been acknowledged, until quite recently. Like the degree to which our scientific knowledge was forged in these trying and difficult and exploitative circumstances. I've written a bit more about that on a blog for the Making of Medicine and the Making of Race blog, which is a project run out of the University of London by Katie Murphy. So I've had some time to reflect on that. The question of the way in which, obviously, the tension between science as a tool of empire and then the kind of attempt to articulate or redirect science as a kind of something for the commonwealth or the common good is something that obviously is at play in all these works when they, people like John Atkins, for example, contemplate the direct implication of Britain and the kind of horrors that they see and the things that are inflicted on other people. So there's a kind of recognition of a kind of universal commonwealth, if you like, of humanity that comes through that British interests or values are at odds with. And I think these doctors are trying to find a way to reorient these ideas of who's included in those categories. Is Trotter an exception? To a degree, yes, I think. There are plenty of many naval surgeons who, came out in support of the trade and wrote manuals just as purely profit-making enterprises to assist the system of slavery. So I guess I find myself thinking also, like, what were the conditions for making these unusual articulations that seem to be in this point of hybridity between something for the commercial and imperial interests of a nation and something which was trying to course correct, trying to grapple with something that many saw in the Navy as being detrimental to British interests, that is, the ending of slavery. So I think his text marks a really interesting inflection point where those two things are at odds. I think the fact that both of the Ramsay and him are Scottish is relevant. They come from a context of British invasion and colonization as themselves, and have then become participant to the empire as workers. The vast majority of naval surgeons, as opposed to army surgeons or the more kind of privileged or prestigious spheres of medicine, the vast majority were Scottish, because they didn't have the means or connections or the reputation to exist within the kind of more privileged spheres of medicine. So they went to sea. And I think there's a kind of, that tension is reflected in Trotter's line of having to go where Britain's cannons roar. I think that's significant. The fact that he's a literary doctor as well, that he starts out as a poet in a tradition of humble and peasant poets in Britain, is also significant, and we can see how that language finds some kind of use in his observations. There's a kind of literariness to it. There's a dramatic dimension to it. It's not just a dry medical text. And the fact that he provides the only instance of someone who is overtly against slavery before he joins a slaving voyage, I think is very reflective of the social and economic dynamics of who works for empire, and what kind of resentments that can bring about as well. So I think those types of things are in play in terms of thinking of him as an exception.
That's great. I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Go right over here. Go ahead. And just hold it quite close to your face.
Is that audible?
Yes.
Great. Fabulous presentations to all the panelists. I was very interesting and very well done. My observation and my question is as follows. In England at this time, we're in the period of the early Industrial Revolution. And there are industrial breakthroughs in many areas, including metal foundry and other technologies. But fundamentally, just as an example, Joseph Priestley's brother-in-law, John Wilkinson, is an iron baron in Birmingham. And he has a contract with the British government to produce cannon. And there is a letter in the collection of the American Philosophical Society from Priestley to Wilkinson castigating him for creating armaments that will injure America, because Priestley, of course, is an American sympathizer. So, the Iron Baron in Birmingham is directly feeling the impact, if you will, of Priestley's pro-American sentiments at the time. But, interestingly, the Industrial Revolution is building machinery that will, in time, abolish the economic need for slavery. That is, machines labor is replacing human labor and animal labor. James Watt is a contemporary of these people. He's inventing a steam engine that will replace the need for many thousands of slaves. And there is machinery being constructed that eventually, we're now in an area, of course, of machine labor that is replacing slave labor. But all these men, all these English industrialists are also, interestingly, abolitionists. Priestley is an abolitionist. Watt is an abolitionist. Wilkinson as well. This entire generation are abolitionists. So the question is, obviously the British have an advantage technologically, but how do you view that as translating into each of your subject matter areas, the Industrial Revolutions driving all of these subject matters?
So the British definitely do have an advantage. Can you see? Okay. You definitely do have an advantage. and this is something I explore more in my book project, is they theoretically have some advantages, but what they run up against in America is a lot of their military advantages go away because of their perceptions of the American environment, and then the soldiers breaking down mind, body, physicality. But I mean, the British, if you just want to look at industrial military complex, have an incredible advantage over the Americans, and I think that, you know, we see that with Stephen's work. But I think sometimes that's theory versus practice. I think we've seen that in our America's more recent history. Just because you have a military advantage and an industrial advantage if you're invading another country, as they were in the American Revolution, that can go away pretty quickly or be diminished very quickly. So.
Yeah, I don't have, you know, because my work wasn't so much about kind of industrial technologies, but just a couple of points that maybe link some more threads that you'd be interested in. So the Brooks was a copper-bottomed boat, and this would have been copper that was extracted from North Wales, and there was a kind of triangular trade there in miniature of copper extraction from the Paris mine to foundries, etc., who were kind of purifying and turning the copper into various materials. And then it found its way onto Navy ships, which gave them a huge advantage in terms of the durability of the boats, but also their speed. And I know that there's obviously there's a lot of debate about the relationship between the Industrial Revolution and abolition. People are there's the idea, of course, of Eric Williams that it was an economic thing. The abolition only happened because of the Industrial Revolution. But more recent work is kind of showing how actually, a lot of industrialists were using wealth from plantations, et cetera, to fund industrial enterprises. So it wasn't kind of just a pure relationship. The industrialists weren't always kind of perfect individuals. And one thing that relates to my paper is actually the conditions for abolitionism were mostly helped and created by the fact of Britain's success in the Napoleonic Wars. And in some ways, that was what Trotter contributed to most by absolutely revolutionizing the medical department of the Navy, transforming the way in which Navy men were paid. He eventually petitioned and got them pensions, so people like him wouldn't find themselves in a position where they had to turn to slavery. So, in a way, you can kind of think about it's not just the things that people say, but it's also what they do behind the scenes that can have these impacts beyond what they thought. That's kind of my thoughts on the matter.
Obviously, directly related to what I'm looking at, the short answer is that in literally the heat of the moment of the 5 years of revolution, the American ability to get its hands on the ongoing industrial revolution was very limited. So, for example, those cannon that Silas Deane got in France and sent over, the Devalier system, basically the French were getting rid of their old stuff because they were already producing new, better stuff, but they gave us their hand-me-downs. There's also a great Deane story, and so it's the American connection is just after the revolution. So, for example, Foxhall, that Jefferson poaches from Philadelphia to Georgetown, is the one who introduces Wilkinson technology to America, but that's 1794. Silas Deane, you may know, after the revolution was accused of mismanagement, embezzlement, et cetera. He was basically stranded in London because the U.S. wouldn't pay their debts to him for what he had bought. In that time, he befriends James Wilkinson's younger brother, William, who had been sent to France to set up boring technology. And there's a letter, I forget who Deane is writing to, back to someone here saying, I have this great idea. We'll set up a manufactory for cannon. But again, that's late 1780s, early 1790s. So all that happens afterwards. And the other good example is Hugh Orr, the guy who is in charge of the Bridgewater furnace. When that cannon foundry process ends, the next thing he does is he imports Scottish textile workers, which kick off the whole Pawtucket, Blackstone Valley textile revolution, which we point directly to. So it's the next generation.
That's great. We're going to turn to the next question, and then we only have about 4 minutes left, so we'll keep the questions and maybe the responses brief.
So I have a question specifically for Vaughn. In listening to you talk about the possible reasons for suicide in the Army, it occurs to me that that's pretty common. It might apply to the French in Haiti, or the Spanish in South America, or the British in Spain, or the Boer War, even maybe the Romans in Carthage. So I'm curious as to whether you looked at sort of the demographic, the per capita suicide, and whether or not the American Revolution was sort of extraordinarily high or extraordinarily low?
That's a great question, and it's something I grapple with. A couple reasons, quick. A lot of the suicides went unmentioned. People didn't want to talk about it. I have found, though, especially priests, their record books of life, death, and they list suicides. But I'm not sure. The short answer is I don't know if it's per capita high or low yet. This is part of bringing the American and the French in is part of a larger project. I will say that I found a lot of instances of suicide among especially British and German soldiers. But kind of my line is that the revolution wasn't exceptional and that it was a hellish war. But for the men who experienced it, it felt exceptional, if that makes sense, because they didn't have these other wars to necessarily compare, especially the British and Germans. Most of them had never been, none of the Germans had been to America, and most of the British soldiers hadn't either. And so I don't have a hard number on what the percentage was, but you see, especially from the quote where the guy was seeing all these other soldiers committing suicide, where he's seeing patterns. And so the fact that he mentions that, I think, lends itself to them perceiving at least a high rate of suicide.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, in the back, we've got one on the internet.
Jeff Appelhans, APS. This question is also for Vaughn, just an extension of that. Is there any evidence of earlier wars being different from the American Revolution? Here I'm thinking more closely like the 7 Years' War, all the way like to Queen Anne's. And was there a difference between British and German suicides versus French? Thanks.
Yeah, another great question. What I would say is way more British and German soldiers invaded America during the Revolution than British soldiers did in the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War. But I kind of place it as this continuum. But I think that what makes the American Revolution exceptional is just how many people indeed did. And I kind of call it, a lot of these soldiers are part of this rediscovery of America, because you have so many soldiers and the camp followers invading America suddenly, that they're all they have all these journals and they're recording the world around them. So I would say it's definitely exceptional in that way. It's this moment, like I said, I'm not a military historian, but I saw it as this great opportunity, like, okay, all these people suddenly are coming in, and part of that, though, is they're away from home, they're feeling vulnerable for so many reasons, and a lot of them are upset and distressed, and sometimes they feel like the only way to take control of their life is to actually take their own lives. And that's actually something that begins before they ever land in America, with the 3,000-mile trip across the Atlantic. There's a point I make in my book, and I'll stop. We think of them from the American side as when they arrive in America, that's when the war starts. But for them, they'd been at sea for 2 or 3 months, and they'd already been at war. And so by the time they arrive in America, they're already broken in mind, body, and spirit, a lot of them.
You didn't? Yes. That concludes our first panel. Thank you so much.